So we have very pronounced trends this year. Starting with the pandemic, there was a very sharp increase in public debt and deficits as governments supported people affected by the pandemic. In the following 2 years, there was gradual tightening of both monetary and fiscal, the result that you pointed to, that led to the sharpest fall in public debt in 2 years on record in the last 70. This year, debt is stopping its decline. Deficits are stopping their decline. And as a matter of fact, there's a turning point with public debt to GDP at the global level going up by about 1.25%, and that number is persistent over the medium term. So that's the short dynamics of public debt in recent years.
So let's talk about why the decline was so dramatic in the last couple of years. How much of that is just on back of inflation, just a nominal decrease in debt?
No, I would say that the single most important driving force was the pandemic and response to the pandemic. After that very strong shock started to abate, macroeconomic conditions started to normalize, support was withdrawn, and so there was a gradual normalization, the theme of the fiscal monitor, in macroeconomic conditions and in fiscal policy. Unfortunately, there was also quite an impressive surge in inflation that did help reduce debt and deficits in the short run. The impact on deficits is very short-lived. In the fiscal monitor, we point to about a year for most countries. In the case of debt, the impact on public debt ratios is more persistent and in levels, and it contributes significantly to the decline of the ratio in these 2 years.
Right. Looking ahead, though, we are obviously operating in a much higher interest rate environment. To what extent is that putting pressure on countries' public finances?
Oh, quite a lot. So as I was pointing out, global public debt trends are up. Deficits and primary deficits stop declining, and they stay well above levels that were seen pre-pandemic. So we are in a situation where public debt is much higher than pre-pandemic, and it's growing faster than pre-pandemic. This being said, the situation of countries around the world is very differentiated. The global trend is dominated by some large advanced economies, some large emerging market economies. These include Brazil, China, Japan, South Africa, Turkey, the United States, the United Kingdom. All of these countries have increases projected in their public debt to GDP ratios above 5 percentage points over 2023 to 2028. While on the other extreme, if you go to low-income developing countries, you see that they were not able to respond much to the pandemic. They were already constrained by their fiscal capacity, by their financial capacity. In our projections, the public debt to GDP ratio goes sharply down this year and continuing over the medium term. And by 2028, the public debt to GDP ratio of these countries is very similar to what was expected to be in 2028 pre-pandemic. This clearly shows how dramatic fiscal constraints, financial constraints are on these countries, and that is a reason for concern given worrisome poverty trends, insufficient progress towards sustainable development goals, and even debt problems in some countries.
Yeah, and let me just ask you this. Short of some of the remedies that the IMF suggests, what can be done other than an eventual restructuring for some of these lower income countries who are increasingly bogged down by higher interest payments?
So the IMF tries to help in several dimensions. For example, financing. Food price surges created challenges of food insecurity in many countries. We have a food shock window that helps. One of the priorities for us at the spring meetings is to replenish the financial capacity of the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is a trust that we use to help the financing of low-income countries. But you're right about that, and we have been trying to expedite the functioning of the G20 common framework, and together with the World Bank and India's presidency of the G20, we organized a global sovereign debt roundtable that is supposed to help the common framework to work better in debt resolution, but also to extend the scope of countries that can benefit from a coordinated approach to debt resolution to middle-income countries.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask you about the extensive energy support packages that were put in place, mostly by European nations last year in response to the spike in energy prices. What is the IMF position on those types of very specific fiscal packages that were put in place merely as a response to the energy shock that we saw?
Two immediate reactions. The first one, we said at the time, and we'll continue saying, that it would have been possible to design those supports better through better targeting. And in the fiscal monitor, you have actually that covered in detail. But recent developments have actually been favorable, and in many cases, the measures that were put in place are no longer necessary. For example, in Portugal and Spain, there is an Iberian approach to energy prices, and there is a cap that is applied. Now, given how much natural gas prices have come down, that cap is no longer binding. Market prices are comfortably below the cap.
So ultimately, the IMF recommendation is some of this support is unnecessary going forwards.
Precisely, and therefore should be phased out. It was meant to be temporary, it should be temporary.
Great.